first start everything.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. I just want to start off by saying that I have a lot of content to cover. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to answer questions during the talk. If you have questions, just write them down. But anyways, yeah, today we're going to be examining the group of animals that we know as reptiles. Now, I think it's fair to say that to the average person, reptile is synonymous with cold-blooded or, lizard-like. They're scaly, somewhat sluggish. And yes, it is true that today, the majority of reptiles do have those characteristics. But however, I would argue that those descriptions aren't representative of all reptiles. In fact, the only reason why we tend to think of them as such is because reptiles with those traits are pretty much the only ones we have left. Oh, sorry. If you were to take a look at the reptiles of the past, one would very quickly realize that the reptiles of today do not represent reptiles as a whole. Throughout Earth's history, reptiles came in all shapes and sizes and were as different in body plans and lifestyles as mammals. So today, we're going to learn about these extinct reptiles, their connections to the reptiles of today, and how this shapes our understanding of them. And hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you look at these creatures a bit differently. Now, of course, I should give a brief background on myself. So, my name is Gannon. Chris is my nickname, and I'm 19, and I'm currently a second-year college student, majoring in organismal biology. I've worked with reptiles in professional settings, such as when I was doing intern work with biologists in the Amazon rainforest. We collected data on surveys for reptiles, and I got to see some pretty cool species, such as blunt-head tree snakes, false coral snakes, and the longest viper species in the world, the South American bushmaster. Oh yeah, I also field herp, mostly in California, but I've gone to other places too. Alright, that's enough about me. Moving on. Now, before we can dive into the evolutionary history of reptiles, we need to understand something else first, something called monophyletic classification. This is the modern day method that scientists use to classify organisms and organize their family trees. It's useful for determining the descendants of an ancestor, figuring out who's related to who, and who is not. And this is fundamental to this whole topic because in order to understand the evolutionary history of reptiles, we need to understand what a reptile is. To best explain what monophyletic classification is, let's look at the group of animals that we belong to, the mammals, specifically bats. Now, we used to think that bats were not mammals. Instead, we thought they were birds. In fact, it appears that some of us still do. There's a reason why if you type in "are bats" in the Google search, the top results will be this. Since then, though, we've discovered that they're not birds. They're mammals. Not only that, but nestled deep within the group, as they are placental mammals, belonging to the same group of mammals as bears and cats, as opposed to mammals like marsupials, which include things like koalas and kangaroos. I mean, sure, a bat might be more similar to many birds than a bear in terms of having a similar body plan, metabolic rate, ecological niche, but it doesn't matter how many superficial traits bats and birds share. As long as bats descend from mammals, that's what they will always be, no matter how much they evolve to look like birds. The traits that they share does not determine their ancestry. And like I said, bats are deep within the mammal group. You see, all the members of placentals are more closely related to each other than any of them are to marsupials, and vice versa. So, genetically speaking, a bear is more related to a bat than that same bear is to a koala or a kangaroo. So you can't consider bears, kangaroos, and koalas to be all mammals, but say bats aren't. If anything, that bear is genetically more like the bat than any of the marsupials. It would be like saying that you and your first cousin are part of the same family, but your sibling isn't. If anything, your sibling is genetically more like you than your first cousin, so that would be an incorrect family tree because it doesn't include all family members. So in order to have a mammal family tree that really does include all mammals, we need to have the most recent ancestor that these mammals shared and all of that ancestor's descendants. You can't only include some descendants and leave others out. No, you need all of them. So the tree should look like this. And notice the forks in the tree. These represent when the groups last shared a common ancestor before their lineages split. The more recently they shared a common ancestor, the more related the two groups are. bears and bats have a more recent common ancestor than either of them have with koalas, because they've had less time to accumulate genetic differences with each other, as opposed to with a koala. That's why bears and bats are more related to each other. It doesn't matter how much a mammal diverges from the mammal template of being hairy, four-legged, and ground-dwelling, like how bats and dolphins do. As long as they descend from a mammal, they will always be mammals. This is one of the rules of monophyletic classification. You can never outgrow your ancestry. So mammals are not only placental mammals, but a type of mammal, which is a type of animal, which is a type of organism. So a bat is an organism, an animal, a mammal, and a placental mammal. Bats are all of those. You can think of classification as folders within folders. Each step up this tree is simply getting more and more specific. Remember, an organism can never leave their folders. This is how we can tell that bats are for sure mammals and definitely not birds. They're also definitely not birds because in order to be a bird, you'd first have to be a reptile. That's right, birds are reptiles. One of the biggest misconceptions about how reptiles are classified has to do with their thermoregulation strategy, namely whether they are cold-blooded or warm-blooded. Growing up, we've all been told that reptiles can only be cold-blooded. So if an animal is warm-blooded like a bird, that animal can't be a reptile, right? No. Whether you're cold-blooded or warm-blooded has nothing to do with being a reptile at all. For the same reason being shaped like a bird has nothing to do with being a mammal. Oh, being warm-blooded has nothing to do with being a mammal either. There actually is a species of mammal that's not warm-blooded, called the naked mole rat. These have very minimal control over their own body temperature and almost entirely depend on the environment to warm up. Yet, this is still a mammal. We don't classify organisms by random characteristics, such as how they regulate body temperature or what they look like. We classify organisms by what they are. Remember that a big reason why we still think of reptiles as only cold-blooded and sluggish is because cold-blooded sluggish reptiles make up most of the reptile groups today. We're biased by what is still alive. This becomes very apparent once you look at what is not alive anymore. If reptiles like dromaeosaurs and ichthyosaurs survived to modern times, we would not see these as just giant lizards. For one, both were warm-blooded and would have acted more like cats or dolphins than any gecko. And they're still reptiles. We'll get more into that later. By the way, the formal terms for warm-blooded and cold-blooded are endothermic and ectothermic. For the sake of simplicity though, I'll continue to use both types of terms. They mean the same thing. And as a refresher, here are the definitions for both terms. I just thought I should touch on this. So anyways, what kind of reptile is a bird? They're dinosaurs. No, not just relatives or related to. Birds are literally dinosaurs, the same way that a python is literally a snake. It's now firmly established that birds are dinosaurs, the only dinosaurs alive today, and we'll get onto how that happened later. For now though, we'll show how dinosaurs are related to other reptiles by examining the reptile family tree, the same way that we examined the mammal family tree, because we want to have a reptile family tree that really does include all reptiles. Reptiles can trace their lineage to the very first land vertebrates, called tetrapods. From here, tetrapods split into two lines. One lineage goes on to give rise to frogs, salamanders, and other amphibians. Amphibians are pretty well adapted to land, but haven't quite made the full transition. The vast majority still need to go back to bodies of water to reproduce and require high humidity, as their skin is permeable and can't prevent water loss. The other lineage, meanwhile, happen to evolve a means to reproduce without a body of water. They can reproduce on dry land and have watertight skin, so they can live in much drier environments than amphibians. These are known as amniotes. Now, these may look somewhat reptilian, but these are not reptiles. They came before reptiles evolved. The lizard look is more of an amniote look. This is the ancestral body plan for all amniotes. Now, one lineage of these amniotes would go on to become reptiles, but the other lineage would produce something very different. From here, the amniotes split into two groups. One is the sauropsids, and the other is the synapsids. Synapsids gave rise to a lot of groups, but only one group survives today, the mammals. Sauropsids branched off into a lot of groups as well, but like the synapsids, only one of these groups is still around today, diapsids. And every single reptile around today can trace their most recent common ancestor right here. So basically, diapsids are reptiles. Oh yeah, something I should mention, mammals did not come from or evolve from reptiles. That's a somewhat common misconception. We share a common ancestor with them as amniotes, but we are not them. We were never them. They're our siblings, not our ancestors. And as you can see on this family tree, Stropsids and Synapsids are sister branches. Some of the extinct Synapsids, such as the one on the left, do look like some reptiles, but they're not reptiles. In order to be a reptile, you'd have to be on the Sauropsid branch. You're not a reptile just because you look like a lizard. The same way that a bat is not a bird, despite similar appearance. Reptiles refer to a specific lineage of Sauropsids. Remember, we go by ancestry, not by looks. The Synapsid right there on the left is more closely related to a cat than to any reptile. Thus, these two lineages, Sauropsids and Synapsids, diverged after amniotes split from amphibians, and they diverged at the same time from them. And because of this, both lineages are equally related to amphibians. So a lizard is only about as related to a salamander as a bear is. Like I said earlier, reptiles are the only living Sauropsids, and mammals the only living Synapsids. So reptiles and mammals are each other's closest living relatives. So essentially, reptiles are our sister group. Anyways, we can now explore the reptile family tree in greater detail. Reptiles split into two main lineages, Archelosaurians and Lepidosauros. Lepidosauros have two living groups, lizards and rhynchocephalians. Lizards make up nearly all of the Lepidosauros today, with roughly 11,990 species of lizard. But rhynchocephalians still have one living species, the tuatara. Tuataras do look like lizards and are their closest living relatives, but tuataras didn't descend from lizards, hence they belong to their own group and are not lizards. Lizards refer to a specific lineage of Lepidosaurian reptiles, not just anything that looks like a lizard. Archelosaurians have three living groups. Turtles, of which are about 360 or so species. They were the first to branch off. And then the turtle sister lineage, which split off into two living groups. Crocodilians, which include around 26 species of caimans, gavials, alligators, and actual crocodiles. And the crocodilian sister branch, the dinosaurs, of which only the birds survive. With roughly 11,000 species alive today, birds are the second most speciose group of reptiles, after lizards. Now, just like the example earlier, the marsupials and placentals, some of these reptiles are more closely related to each other than to others. As you can see, crocodilians branched off from birds the most recently. Thus, their most recent common ancestor is with birds. So, crocodilians are genetically more related to reptiles like birds, like that one over there, called a frogmouth, than to any other reptile. And as you can see, tuataras branched off from lizards last. That's why their closest relatives are lizards. This is all confirmed by genomic studies too, so now we know that this is what an accurate family tree of living reptiles looks like. But if we included extinct reptiles, this tree would be quite a bit more full. That's what we're going to cover in this next section. Though they are extinct, the reptiles of the past have significantly filled in our understanding of the reptiles of today. We're going to start our journey into the beginning of what's called the Mesozoic era, which is divided into three periods, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. The Mesozoic occurred before the current era we're in, the Cenozoic, and this era lasted for a very, very long time, beginning about 252 million years ago and ending 66 million years ago. And to give you an idea of just how long that is, the first mammals originated roughly 167 million years ago, and didn't become the dominant land animals until about 66 million years ago, when the asteroid hit. So for the first 100 million years of our existence, we were under the reign of dinosaurs. We spent more of our existence being dominated by reptiles than outside of it. The Mesozoic era was the peak for reptiles in terms of ecological niches, body plans, and probably species. There's a reason why this is called the Age of Reptiles. Notice though, how I said reptiles and not dinosaurs. And that's because for the first period of the Mesozoic, the Triassic, the dinosaurs were not the dominant large land creatures. Let's go back to family trees for a quick moment. So, the greater family of reptiles that birds and crocodiles belong to are collectively known as archosaurs. Archosaurs divide into pseudotsuchians and avimetatarsalians. Avimetatarsalians refer to all archosaurs more closely related to birds than to crocodiles, or crocodilians, and pseudosuchians refer to all archosaurs more related to crocodilians than birds. That out of the way. The Triassic period began after a mass extinction had just occurred, the Permian-Triassic extinction event, the most devastating extinction event of all time, having wiped out 90% of life on the planet. Before this, the dominant land animals were synapsids, mammal relatives, like this gorgonopsid right here. And with these proto-mammals gone, reptiles now had the chance to become the dominant land creatures. Now, this is a particularly important period for all reptiles because this is when the major groups appeared. Around the early to middle Triassic, the first known rhynchocephalians and lizards appeared, and the lineages leading to archosaurs had also appeared. Now, there's a few important things about archosaurs. When mammals breathe, air goes back and forth out the lungs in the same direction. This is called tidal breathing. This does work, but it's not the most efficient because stale air that's been used up by the lungs will mix with the fresh air that's inhaled. Archosaurs don't have this problem. They have what's called unidirectional breathing. Air moves in only one direction throughout the respiratory system. Stale air never mixes with fresh air. Thus, archosaurs are able to extract more oxygen every time they breathe. Reptiles like birds and crocodiles, or crocodilians, can breathe better than mammals. Archosaurs also have 4-chambered hearts, as opposed to 3-chambered hearts of turtles and lepidosaurs. 4-chambered hearts allow for sustained strenuous activity, and this would later be inherited by their future descendants. But back in the Triassic, 4-chambered hearts and unidirectional breathing was normal for reptiles, and probably helped archosaurs become the new dominant land creatures. Particularly, pseudosuchians were able to dominate. By the middle Triassic, large carnivorous pseudosuchians such as Batrachotomus were running around. At about 20 feet long and 400 pounds, this was a fairly decently sized carnivore. At first glance, this kind of looks like a long-legged crocodile, with an upright posture and legs positioned directly below the body. Already pretty different from today's crocodilians. But there's something else that's different. Batrachotomus was warm-blooded. How do we know this? You see, large endothermic animals are able to grow fast. Really, really fast compared to large ectotherms. This is because having a high body temperature that stays stable allows for the body's processes for growth to work efficiently. And when I say stable, I mean really stable. A fast-growing creature like a lion keeps their ideal body temperature range around 100 to 102 degrees. Anything above or below that, and they get sick. Meanwhile, a slow-growing creature like a crocodile keeps their ideal body temperature range around 84 to 93 degrees. You see how much fluctuation that is? A crocodile can have their temperature drop 5 degrees and be fine. Meanwhile, that same temperature drop can give a lion hypothermia. But regulation to such a narrow degree allows for super efficient growth. That's why large endotherms, such as lions, can reach adult size in only 3 years, where large ectotherms, such as saltwater crocodiles, take 10 years just to do the same. Analysis on the fossil material has shown that Batrachotomus reached their 20-foot, 400-pound adult size in just 3 years. You can't grow this fast, being a large, cold-blooded creature. Also, once again, note their posture. These reptiles would have acted more like bears than alligators. Fast forward to the late Triassic, and the ecosystem is full of reptiles. If you were to take a look at the world around this time, this is the wildlife you would have seen. Can you guess which ones are dinosaurs? I'll give you the answer. Just these 4. Every other animal here is a crocodile relative. You had armadillo-like herbivores, bipedal carnivores that stood like a T-Rex, bipedal herbivores that looked like a crocodilian ostrich, and large reptilian bear-looking things. Remember, none of these are dinosaurs. These are all more closely related to crocodiles. It was a crocodile and friends world in the late Triassic. Though most wouldn't have acted like today's crocodilians, just like the example earlier, many of these had rapid growth rates, like endotherms. And endothermic animals need to eat a lot more than ectotherms. Unlike crocodilians today, which can go without food for months, something like Saurosuchus here would probably need to eat as often as a lion. So if this thing saw you, it might try to run you down and eat you. It would be wise to treat these reptiles like grizzly bears, not crocodiles. Though they could eat grizzly bears too, it's estimated that the biggest Saurosuchus individuals were 1.6 tons in weight. or 3,300 pounds, compared to a grizzly bear's average weight of 600 pounds. Also, something about Saurosuchus. Another reason why this reptile was most likely warm-blooded, other than their fast growth rate, was that the environment Saurosuchus lived in was kind of cold. This reptile lived in northern Argentina, which in the late Triassic was closer to the South Pole. The specific area had an annual temperature of about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A city today that would have a similar climate would be in Roseburg, Oregon. Summer temperatures would probably be a bit warmer than Roseburg, but do you see the rest of these year's temperatures? For at least 6 months out of the year, Saurosuchus lived through weather in the 50s and 60s. Place a Komodo dragon or crocodile in this climate and see how long they last. I'll give you a hint, not long. Speaking of crocodiles, their ancestors were also around in the late Triassic, but they were very different to their descendants today. They were small, about the size of dogs, and kind of looked like dogs too, with long legs and upright postures. And they were also warm-blooded, like many of their contemporaries. They kind of looked like reptilian foxes sprinting after small prey. There were many other interesting things going on with reptiles at this time. Some of the first turtles emerged at this point, like Proganochelys. Well, turtles with shells at least. Turtles had already split from archosaurs way before the Triassic, and up until this point, were slowly developing their shell. If you didn't know, turtle shells are just their ribs fused with their backbones. And as you can guess, the very first turtle did not have a shell, but had very broad ribs. These ribs, over millions of years, flattened and fused with the spine, eventually giving rise to the turtle shell. Ichthyosaurs had already been in the water for millions of years at this point, and some were huge carnivores, like Himalayasaurus. Himalayasaurus was more than 3 times the size of the biggest orcas, at 35 tons and 50 feet long. This had a mouthful of serrated teeth, and this creature would have eaten the other marine reptiles at the time, such as the seal-like sauropterygians, some of which could be over 10 feet long and over 100 pounds. By the way, I should mention, we don't know exactly where ichthyosaurs and sauropterygians go on the reptile family tree. We know they're diapsids, but who they're more closely related to, that's still in progress. But they're too cool to leave out though, so. Anyways, clearly, reptiles dominated aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, and they were even beginning to take to the skies. In the late Triassic, the earliest known pterosaurs appeared. Pterosaurs are avian-metatarsalians, very closely related to dinosaurs, and they were the first known vertebrates that could fly. They walked on all fours and also had very interesting wing anatomy. So, imagine you lost your pinky, and your ring finger grew huge, like as long as your whole arm and just as thick. Your ring finger can now also fold backwards against your arm. This is how pterosaur wings are constructed. They fly with their ring fingers. In the future, these would grow huge, but for now, they're rather small, about the size of a small dog. The dinosaurs, while present, did not make up a huge component of the ecosystem. Some did get pretty big, but for the most part, they had to yield to pseudosuchians, especially dinosaurs like Coelophysis, who would have needed to steer clear from Postosuchus. Let's take a look at Coelophysis for a second. Coelophysis belonged to the group of dinosaurs known as theropods. Here's a family tree, so you can see where theropods belong exactly among dinosaurs. Like pretty much all dinosaurs, theropods were warm-blooded. But they have something that other dinosaurs do not, a strange bone known as a furcula. You can see the furcula right here on a fossil of Coelophysis. The furcula is more commonly known as a wishbone. Coelophysis is the first known theropod with this wishbone. This, as you can probably guess, will be inherited by theropods in the future. And at the end of the Triassic, the future was looking bright for them because another mass extinction would occur. The end Triassic mass extinction. Around 201 million years ago, the end Triassic, this mass extinction, thought to be propagated by volcanic activity, put an end to the majority of pseudosuchians, with only one group making it past the Triassic, the crocodilian morphs, which you can see right there. These would later give rise to true crocodilians, but also a few other interesting groups, as we will see later. Also, there doesn't seem to be any more endothermic pseudosuchians after the Triassic, so it was at this point that crocodilian morphs became ectothermic. It's not entirely known why, but it is suggested that being ectothermic is better suited for their semi-aquatic ambush lifestyle. But anyways, with the dominant pseudosuchians gone, dinosaurs had a chance to take their place. This is when dinosaurs would take over and become the dominant land animals. Fast forward to the early Jurassic, and the wildlife already looks pretty different. Dilophosaurus had arrived and was among the first truly large predatory dinosaurs. At around 880 pounds, these were as big as polar bears. You were also likely to see tons of brachiocephalians, which achieved a global distribution by the early Jurassic. There's only the two Atara today, but back in the early Jurassic, these reptiles were found everywhere. They were the dominant group of small reptiles back then, and were essentially the lizards of the Jurassic. In the water, there are sauropterygians in the form of plesiosaurs. Their bodies kind of looked like that of a turtle, except they had no shell, and many had really long necks. Also, unlike turtles, these were warm-blooded. Once again, growth rates help determine this. The super huge whale-like ichthyosaurs went extinct, and we are left with dolphin-like ones. We have some, like Temnodontosaurus, an orca-sized apex predator that ate other marine reptiles, and Uranosaurus, who kind of looked like a swordfish with an elongated upper jaw. And Ichthyosaurus, the one that the whole group is named after. As you can see, they do vary in size quite a bit. By the way, this body shape isn't just speculation. We have fossils that preserve the outline of these reptiles. And not only were these marine reptiles warm-blooded, able to fully control their own body temperature, they also had blubber, like whales do. A fossil specimen of an ichthyosaur, I forgot the species, preserved a fat layer, and this layer of blubber would conserve the body heat they generated and act as insulation. On that same specimen, we found out that ichthyosaurs did not have scales. Their skin was smooth, just like a dolphin. Probably helped them cut through the water fast. And well, these guys were fast, swimming just as fast as dolphins at around 30 miles per hour. And they didn't lay eggs. We have fossils of ichthyosaurs that showed they gave live birth, just like dolphins. There's a reason why ichthyosaurs are known as dolphins of the Mesozoic. In the Middle Jurassic, there's an important thing that happens with dinosaurs. At this point, a new group of theropods had just arrived. These were the Coelurosaurs. Being theropods, they had wishbones, but they also had something else. They had small filamentous feathers, most likely used for insulation or display. They didn't quite have the derived feathers that can be found on birds, called pennaceous feathers, but they were on their way. But for now, let's get on to the late Jurassic. This is when reptile diversity seems to really pick up. If you took a walk through some late Jurassic forests at night, you might see what appear to be bats. But no, these are reptiles. These are pterosaurs, called anurognathids. They were tiny, had short stubby snouts, large eyes, and were covered in this proto-feather filament that looked like fur. They were basically bats before bats existed. And like all pterosaurs, these were warm-blooded. If you took a boat out to the ocean, well, there doesn't seem to be any huge predatory ichthyosaurs at this time, but there were pliosaurs, big pliosaurs. These were a group of short-necked, big-headed plesiosaurs that were the top predators in the late Jurassic seas. Some, such as pliosaurus, could be 17 to 18 tons in weight and 36 feet in length. And as you can see, this pliosaur had massive flippers to help speed through the water. There were also some other interesting marine reptiles. Remember earlier how I said that crocodilian morphs would evolve into some interesting forms? Well, here's one of them. This is Plesiosuchus, a metriorhynchid. Metriorhynchids were fully aquatic pseudoseuchians and lived in the water permanently. And yes, we know from fossil evidence that these reptiles had a tail just like a shark. They gave live birth and had smooth, scaleless skin, very unlike the modern pseudoseuchians today, the crocodilians. We also know that, unlike the pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs they swam with, metriorhynchids were not warm-blooded, but not cold-blooded either. Instead, they appear to have been mesothermic, which is a thermoregulation strategy that's between endothermy and ectothermy. If you didn't know, there is such a thing. So while they could regulate their body temperature better than sea turtles, they weren't fully capable of maintaining that temperature, not the way that the endothermic plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs could. Clearly, the late Jurassic skies and seas were full of reptiles. But now let's look at the terrestrial ecosystems. Let's travel to North America specifically, where there were giant dinosaurs. Late Jurassic North America was home to sauropods such as Brachiosaurus and Camarasaurus. By this time, dinosaurs were enormous, bigger than any land mammal that has ever existed. Brachiosaurus was 55 tons and 80 feet long. And you might be wondering, why were dinosaurs able to get so big? Well, one, the fact that they lay eggs. Contrary to what some may believe, giving live birth is not better than laying eggs. In fact, it's worse in some cases. You see, mammals need to gestate their babies inside their bodies, and the larger a mammal gets, the bigger the fetus and the longer the gestation. Elephants are pregnant for almost 2 years and give birth to newborns that are over 200 pounds. At some point, a land mammal can only get so big before the energetic cost of growing a fetus is too much. Dinosaurs, on the other hand, laid eggs that weren't even very big. Even sauropods laid eggs that were typically under a foot across. Their eggs stay small relative to their body size. They don't need to invest so much energy in growing a baby inside their body. Another reason, theropods and sauropods have pneumatic bones. Now, when people say that birds have hollow bones, what they really mean to say is that they have pneumatic ones. Their bones aren't literally hollow like a drinking straw. It's more that their bones are filled with air sacs, just like this. And birds are not the only dinosaurs with these bones. Far from it. Sauropods like Brachiosaurus and theropods like Allosaurus had the same bones. And as it turns out, these provide greater structural support than mammal bones, better able to carry weight. Mammals are simply not built to get as big as these reptiles. Let's look at the carnivores. One carnivore you might have encountered in late Jurassic North America was Marsosaurus. At 440 pounds, this dinosaur was the size of a lion. Nowadays, lions are the largest terrestrial carnivores in their ecosystem, outsizing every other land carnivore they live with. Remember, we're talking about dinosaurs, whose pneumatic bones and egg laying allowed them to get much larger. Now take a look at who Marsosaurus lived with. This was an ecosystem where carnivores the size of a lion were among the smaller predators. Ceratosaurus was almost a ton in weight, about the size of a bison. Allosaurus could be 2 to 3 tons in weight, a little larger than a rhino. And Torvosaurus was the size of an Asian elephant, at 4 to 5 tons. Even the smallest of these three would be able to rip apart that lion right there. And believe it or not, theropods would only continue to get larger from here. But there were also some smaller theropods in the late Jurassic, and a special one in particular. Parraves emerged sometime in the middle to late Jurassic. Here's one of them, Anchiornis, who was also the first known dinosaur with pennaceous feathers, the same type of feathers that can be found on the wings of birds today. Like this blue-gray tanager that was caught while doing some bird banding during my internship. Pennaceous feathers would be inherited by all Paravian dinosaurs, and we'll cover some of them in this next part, because we are now in the early Cretaceous. This is the last part of the Mesozoic, and it gave rise to the first snakes, the first true birds, the first crocodilians, and more. It was also a crucial period for lizards. Rhynchocephalians began to decline in the early Cretaceous, and lizards began to really diversify. The first known iguanians appeared during this time. Iguanians are a group of lizards that include things like uromastyx, chameleons, and actual iguanas. All three of those lizards can trace their most recent common ancestor all the way to the early Cretaceous. Lizards will continue to radiate in the Cretaceous, and we'll revisit them. But for now, let's get back to dinosaurs. Parraves, the group that we touched on earlier, has given rise to some new groups, such as dromaeosaurs. As you can probably guess, this is the group of theropods that Velociraptor belonged to. But Velociraptor didn't exist until the late Cretaceous, and we're not there yet. Some early Cretaceous dromaeosaurs, such as Microraptor, were fairly small, around 2 to 3 pounds, while others, such as Utahraptor, got to over 1,000 pounds. And yet, there were feathered dinosaurs that were even bigger than this. This is Eutyrannus. We have fossil remains that preserve the impression of their feathers, which are around 7 to 8 inches long. At 1.6 tons, this is the largest fully feathered dinosaur that we know of. And finally, in the early Cretaceous, the very first birds as we know them had arrived. These were known as the ornithothoraces, who had arisen from Parraves. Turns out that feathers were not only great for keeping warm, you can also use them to fly. The second group of vertebrates to evolve powered flight were once again reptiles. The oceans in the early Cretaceous aren't too different from the late Jurassic. There were still pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Some were mean carnivores, such as Kronosaurus and Kaiaitaisuka. In the beginning of the late Cretaceous, the world would continue to be like this until something called the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary event. This was a mild extinction event that occurred around 93.9 million years ago, caused by a decrease in oxygen in the oceans and warming temperatures. As mild as this was, this event gave rise to the biggest lizards of all time. And let's look at lizards during this point. Lizards had already split into many families. There were geckos, skinks, and a group called toxicopherans. Toxicopheran lizards gave rise to Varanoidea, the earliest representatives of the monitor lizard family, like Komodo dragons and water monitors. These lizards had powerful legs with large claws at the end of their fingers, but another group of toxicopherans went the other direction. Their legs shrank down until they were so small that they were useless, and eventually would be missing entirely. These lizards are more commonly known as snakes. That's right, snakes are a type of lizard. Varanoids and skinks share a more recent common ancestor with snakes than geckos, and are both more closely related to snakes than geckos. So if you want to call skinks monitors and geckos lizards, then snakes must be lizards too. So if any of you keep snakes, you are a lizard keeper. Remember, organisms can't outgrow their ancestry. There was another group of toxicopherans at this time that were semi-aquatic. Here's what they would have looked like. These lizards were pretty well adapted to life in the oceans, but couldn't make the transition to becoming fully aquatic. There were still pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs filling the niche of large carnivores. They couldn't occupy a role that's already taken. Until the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary event lowered oxygen levels in the ocean. This caused ecosystem collapse and was enough to kill the last ichthyosaurs. Pliosaurs were hit hard and went extinct shortly after, and these semi-aquatic lizards from earlier were now able to take their place. Fast forward 14 million years. During this time, there was a sea that covered Midwestern North America, called the Western Interior Seaway, and it was full of marine reptiles. There were plesiosaurs, such as Styxosaurus, with huge necks, as well as short-necked, tiny plesiosaurs called polycotylids, like dog corncrops right in the middle. There were dinosaurs, such as Hesperornis, a giant diving bird, along with pterosaurs, such as Pteranodon, who could have wingspans of up to 20 feet, and enormous sea turtles, such as Archelon, the biggest turtle of all time, being up to 15 feet long and 3.5 tons. That's heavier than most rhinos, by the way. True crocodiles were around at this point as well, having evolved recently, and some were huge. Deinosuchus could be 36 feet in length and weigh 8 tons. This crocodilian could easily eat an elephant. The semi-aquatic lizards from earlier were the first mosasaurs, and by this point, they had grown into the top predators of the oceans. They ditched land entirely and developed flippers, the ability to give live birth and tail flukes. This is what they turned into. This is what they turned into. Mosasaurs were the biggest lizards of all time. Tylosaurus was 40 feet long. It could weigh up to 10 tons. Remember, this is not a dinosaur. This is not a crocodile. This is a lizard, a genuine lizard. Mosasaurs only existed for 25 million years, but in that time frame, they became highly successful. Let's look at the world at the end of the Cretaceous, around 72 to 66 million years ago, because it was really full of giant reptiles. The world at this time actually didn't look too different from today. The ocean that covered North America had mostly dried up. Flowers, which evolved in the early Cretaceous, were everywhere. Flowering plants became the dominant plant life in the late Cretaceous, just as they are now. You might have come across the first boas, which had just evolved. There were bees, spiders, palm trees, and overall the world doesn't look too different from that of today. Until you ran into this. Pterosaurs peaked in size at this time. Some, such as Quetzalcoatlus, were among the largest, with wingspans that could reach 35 feet in length and could stand as tall as a giraffe. Though they weigh a lot less than you might think, they had lightweight skeletons that greatly reduced their mass. But at 500 pounds, this is like a tiger flying around. And not only could they could fly well. They took off from the ground with ease. Unlike birds, which use their legs to take off, pterosaurs use their arms to power jump in the air. Vampire bats take off from the ground using their arms too, And pterosaurs would do the same thing, but of course on a much larger scale. It would look like this. They could probably clear 8 feet doing this. Think about the muscle power that's needed to jump that high. And it turns out that launching on all fours like this is much more efficient than launching from 2 legs. Thus, they could get much larger than birds, which is why pterosaurs were the biggest flying animals of all time. At the same time that Quetzalcoatlus existed, there was Tyrannosaurus rex. Tyrannosaurus is the largest land carnivore ever, as far as we know. They were 8 to 10 tons on average, but we have specimens that reach 12 tons. And as you can see, part of this weight came from the fact that this creature was incredibly robust. T-Rex's jaws were powerful and could bite down with over 5 tons of force. T-Rex also had excellent binocular vision with forward-facing eyes. And T-Rex could also likely see in more colors than you, given that birds today have generally 4 color receptors, unlike the 3 that we possess. And not only were reptiles huge during this time, they were everywhere. If you travel to Alaska during the winter on a particularly cold day, this is what you might have seen: dinosaurs in the snow. Now, the Mesozoic did have warmer temperatures on average than today, but this did not mean that everywhere was Hawaii. The late Cretaceous Prince Creek fossil bed in northern Alaska does not have the remains of crocodiles, lizards, and turtles, for the same reason that you don't find any of those reptiles in northern Alaska today. Ectothermic reptiles appear to be entirely absent from the environment, but there were plenty of endothermic reptiles. We find theropods, such as dromaeosaurs and nanoxaurs, a cousin of T-Rex, and large herbivores, such as pachyrhinosaurs. And many didn't even migrate either. Pachyrhinosaurs stayed in the North Pole year-round. During the winter, they would have experienced 4 months of darkness, no sunlight, and temperatures in the 30s and 40s. In the winter, you could have seen nanoxaurs hunt pachyrhinosaurs, much like how wolves hunt elk in the snow today. Reptiles not only survived, but thrived in cold climates, and it wasn't just on land either. Let's travel to the opposite end of the world, in the South Pole. It wasn't quite as cold as it is today, but the water temperature at the time was not a jacuzzi either. Water temperatures in late Cretaceous Antarctica were about 45 degrees. And to give you an idea of how cold that is, if any of you have ever swam off of the beaches here in San Diego in the wintertime, that's only about 55 to 62 degrees. In the late Cretaceous, Lopez de Bertadano fossil beds in Antarctica, we don't find the remains of sea turtles. However, we do find plenty of plesiosaurs, such as Aristodecnes, who is also believed to be a filter feeder, and over 5 genera of mosasaurs, such as Caecilius. Mosasaurs were unique because not only were they the largest lizards of all time, they were also the only fully warm-blooded lizards. Research has shown that mosasaurs were not cold-blooded. Instead, they had a metabolism that kept their body temperatures in the low to high 90s, similar to marine mammals like manatees and dolphins. These giant lizards were thriving and hunting in waters that would give you hypothermia in 30 minutes. So they definitely did not need a heat rock. At the end of the Cretaceous, mosasaurs peaked in species diversity and lived in every ocean on the planet. Mosasaurs also had forked tongues, like many other lizards. Aquatic snakes can smell underwater with their tongues, and presumably it was not different for mosasaurs. And their prey would vary. Some, such as plotosaurs, were fast-swimming hunters, able to swim 30 miles per hour. Others, such as globidens, had blunt teeth to crush hard-shelled prey. If you traveled to the Atlantic Ocean at this time, you might have ran into mosasaurs proper. Mosasaurs could be 45 feet long and weigh 11 tons. Some estimates even place their maximum weight at 15 tons. This was an apex predator that ate for other marine reptiles, sharks, and any other creature they wanted to. This was the world of the end Cretaceous. Just think about this for a moment. There was a point in Earth's history where the largest carnivores on the planet were lizards that were warm-blooded, larger than elephants, and acted like orcas. And there were carnivores on land that had bite forces capable of crushing a car and could be 15 or 16 feet tall. All while there's creatures that were that same height or larger and were flying around in the skies. The world was like this until a huge rock from outer space came crashing into Earth. I'm sure you guys have heard of the meteor that put an end to dinosaur dominance, and it was devastating. 75% of all life was wiped from the planet. All mosasaurs and plesiosaurs died out, all pterosaurs died out, and nearly all of the dinosaurs except one lineage of theropods, the birds. And even then, they nearly died out too. Here's a family tree of all the birds that were around at this time. I circled the group that modern day birds belong to. Every other group that you see on this chart went extinct. As devastating as this was, reptiles survived and continued to push on. And with that, the Mesozoic ended and the Cenozoic began, the current era we're in. Now I wish I could explore reptile evolution in the Cenozoic here in more detail. There were so many cool things that happened, but I can't run too long, so this brings me here. So now after learning all this, here are some things that you might realize about reptiles. 1. Many reptiles have lineages that are very old. This is probably the least surprising fact. But yeah, many groups of reptiles today were already around when dinosaurs were the dominant land animals. Geckos originated around 100 million years ago. Boas came about at least 70 million years ago. And skinks also originated around 100 million years ago. 2. A lot of reptile things are just things that lepidopsaurs do. So, adding up the species numbers from earlier, roughly 51% of reptiles are lepidopsaurs, so lizards and the tuatara, and about 49% of reptiles are ecological, turtles, birds, and crocodilians. Almost half of all reptiles do not shed their skin, at least not the way that lizards and tuataras do. As you know, lepidopsaurs shed their skin in one piece, or multiple large pieces. However, turtles, birds, and crocodilians do not do this. They replace their skin bit by bit. Also, no archelosaur has ever lost all of their legs. As far as I'm aware, the closest that they came to this was in some bird lineages who lost their wings and arms entirely. Meanwhile, plenty of lizards, as you guys probably all know, have lost all of their legs. 2. Just because a reptile is huge and looks ancient does not make them a dinosaur. You've probably seen this all the time. People will see a crocodile or a big lizard and be like, oh, that's a dinosaur. No, those are not dinosaurs at all. If you remember the family trees I showed you earlier, dinosaurs are a group within archosaurs. Specifically, there are metatarsalians, and with that, dinosauria. So pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, crocodilians are not dinosaurs, turtles are not dinosaurs, and lizards are definitely not dinosaurs. Lizards are all the way on the other side of the reptile family tree. They're about as far from a dinosaur as a reptile could be. Calling lizards dinosaurs is like calling elephants koalas, as koalas are marsupials and elephants are placental mammals. So if elephants can't be koalas, lizards definitely cannot be dinosaurs. Which brings me to the next thing that you might realize about reptiles. Dinosaurs are not really extinct. They almost became extinct, but we still have birds. You might have noticed throughout the talk I was slowly building up the family tree that led to birds. So here it is, completed. I made it a bit easier to read and also included some famous dinosaurs, such as Triceratops, Brontosaurus, Velociraptor. You can see how Triceratops branched off from the family tree first. Thus, the other dinosaurs shown here have a more recent common ancestor with each other than with Triceratops. In other words, every single dinosaur shown on here is more closely related to birds than to Triceratops. This is why birds are considered dinosaurs. And to say otherwise would be like saying that house cats, bobcats, and lions are not cats. It's like saying that house cats, bobcats, and lions are cats, but not cheetahs. Even though bobcats and house cats are more related to cheetahs than to lions. So birds are a type of dinosaur, the way that cheetahs are a type of cat. Sure, a hummingbird might not look like Triceratops or Brontosaurus, but then again, bats don't look anything like rhinos or elephants, so appearances don't really matter. Remember, ancestry, not looks. And because dinosaurs are reptiles, which I don't think I need to explain why, this brings me to the third thing. You have eaten reptiles before, fourth thing. Maybe even recently. Unless you were vegan the day that you were born, you've eaten a lot of reptile meat. Every time you eat eggs, you are eating reptile eggs. Anytime you eat dinosaurs, like this roasted duck right here, you are eating reptile meat. But okay, other than food, think about what this means. The most intelligent reptiles we have today are crows and parrots, both of which have the ability to make and use tools, mimic speech, and recognize themselves in a mirror. Just think about that. We have reptiles today that can talk. Birds aren't even the only reptiles that can use tools. Archosaurs in general are intelligent. Crocodilians can use tools as well. Birds and crocodilians exhibit lots of parental care, and both can engage in cooperative pack hunting. There's avian flu, a disease that you catch from reptiles. It's a disease named after a group of dinosaurs. Also, it affects crocodilians too, which I found out not too long ago. Reptiles live all over the world. Marine reptiles, for example, are in every ocean, from penguins in Antarctica to sea snakes in the Pacific. The largest and most physically powerful animal on land was a reptile. Argentinosaurus could have weighed 100 tons. The fastest animal alive today is a reptile, the peregrine falcon, which can go 240 miles per hour. Powered flight has only evolved 4 times in animals. Half of those times were achieved by reptiles. Oh yeah, there's also this. It's not really a feat, but I don't know of any other animal that can give you a problem like this, other than like human children. But in this case, the animal that gives you this kind of problem happens to be a reptile. So I just thought this is kind of cool. But moving on. Reptiles are not some lesser creatures below mammals. They're just as evolved, and reptiles match or even exceed mammals in some areas. Obviously, no organism is better than the other. But yeah, reptiles as a whole cannot be defined as ectothermic or sluggish. There's so much more than that. Throughout Earth's history, they were also endothermic, energetic, smart, and highly active creatures. They were, and still are, some of the most impressive animals today. Plus, the closest living relatives of mammals are reptiles, so they're much closer to us than many realize. Okay, are there any questions?